Sarah Brooks, a seasoned police officer with over 20 years of experience, was preparing for a trip to the National Police Chiefs Conference in Chicago. This morning was different from most. She had decided to travel without her uniform, simply as a regular passenger. No badge, no responsibilities. Just a break from the weight of her usual role. As she entered the bustling airport, Sarah made her way to the security line, passing through the busy terminals full of travelers rushing to their flights. It was a familiar scene, but today she wasn't just a part of the crowd. She was a passenger on a mission to have a brief respite from the pressures of law enforcement. She carried nothing more than a carry-on with some clothes for the trip and a few personal items. Her first-class ticket, something she had earned through years of hard work, felt like a small reward, a chance to travel comfortably for once. While navigating through the terminal, Sarah noticed a Hispanic family struggling to read the gate directory. The father looked puzzled, trying to make sense of the signs while his children appeared anxious. Sarah, fluent in Spanish, approached them with a smile and offered help. She quickly gave them directions to their gate, feeling a sense of pride in helping them. The family expressed their gratitude, and Sarah couldn't help but feel fulfilled, as it reminded her of why she had become a police officer in the first place: to help people who needed it most. Unbeknownst to Sarah, her kind gesture did not go unnoticed. Captain Dana Wright, a senior flight officer with Atlantic Airways, had been walking through the terminal nearby. When she saw Sarah helping the family, her expression tightened. Dana had been in the airline business long enough to know the kind of passengers that belonged in first class, and in her eyes, Sarah didn't fit that mold. Dana didn't give Sarah a second glance as she passed by, but the suspicion was already planted. When Sarah arrived at her gate, she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, Linda Cole. Linda glanced at it briefly before giving Sarah a look that seemed just a little too cautious. Her eyes flicked briefly to Captain Wright, who was now standing nearby, reviewing papers as though she were keeping a casual watch over the boarding process. Linda paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then said, "This seems unusual." Her voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to overhear, and the message was clear. Something about Sarah's presence in first class wasn't right. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Sarah asked calmly, keeping her voice steady. She could feel the stares of the passengers around her, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Linda hesitated before typing a bit more slowly into her system. Sarah knew exactly what was happening. She had faced this before. People like her, especially Black people, often had to prove their right to spaces others took for granted. "We need to verify this," Linda said, her tone dismissive, clearly making a show of questioning Sarah's legitimacy. Sarah stood still, taking a slow breath. She knew that reacting would only feed into the narrative they were trying to create. Around her, white passengers sailed through the line without question. Sarah, however, was subjected to more scrutiny. Captain Wright observed from a distance, nodding subtly as if approving of Linda's actions. It was clear that Sarah was being made an example of, a reminder that some people didn't belong in certain spaces, regardless of what their ticket said. It wasn't long before Linda called over a supervisor, and Sarah stood there, forced to wait as others boarded their flights. A feeling of discomfort crept up, but Sarah remained composed. This wasn't the first time she had been subjected to this kind of treatment, but it still stung. After a few minutes of unnecessary delays, Sarah's boarding pass was finally approved. She was cleared to board the plane, but the humiliation lingered. As she walked toward the gate, Sarah could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. They had witnessed everything, but none had intervened. She held her head high, reminding herself that she belonged there, that she was not the one who had made the situation uncomfortable. The flight to Chicago was uneventful at first. Sarah settled into her first-class seat with the quiet satisfaction of a well-earned break. The seat was comfortable, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax, looking out the window as the plane taxied down the runway. It had been a long time since she had experienced a flight without the weight of her uniform, and it felt almost surreal, but the peace wouldn't last. As the plane ascended, Sarah noticed Captain Dana Wright walking down the aisle, her uniform immaculate and posture rigid. The captain's eyes met Sarah's briefly, and Sarah felt a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Dana didn't acknowledge her, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had the distinct impression that Dana was watching her more closely than any other passenger. Across the aisle, Linda Cole, the gate agent, was now in her flight attendant uniform, moving through the cabin. She passed by Sarah without so much as a glance at first, but then Sarah caught Linda's eyes lingering on her for just a second too long. Linda quickly looked away, but the momentary exchange made Sarah's stomach tighten. She had seen this kind of treatment before. Subtle, but undeniable. It was as if Sarah's mere presence in first class was an affront to the status quo. The feeling of being scrutinized, of being out of place, began to intensify as the flight continued. Sarah had traveled frequently for work, and she had seen how certain passengers were treated differently. But this felt more deliberate, more personal. She had long been aware of the biases people carried, even in a professional setting. But this felt like more than just a casual judgment. This was something systemic. As the flight attendants went about their duties, Sarah tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort. She reached for the in-flight magazine, scanning through the pages, but her mind kept returning to the way she had been treated at the gate. She had been questioned unnecessarily, made to feel as though her first-class seat wasn't hers to claim. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore. A few hours into the flight, the captain made her routine rounds through the cabin. Dana's steps were purposeful as she moved down the aisle, her eyes briefly scanning each passenger. Sarah sat still, trying not to draw attention to herself. She had been through enough today. She didn't want to make any waves, but Dana's sharp gaze kept drifting toward her. It was as though she couldn't help but check Sarah's every move. By now, Sarah was used to being an other in spaces where she wasn't supposed to be, but there was something about the way Captain Wright was observing her that made her feel like a target. She had been traveling for decades, and she had seen how people like her were often treated with suspicion, but the subtlety of it, the coldness, was unsettling. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice interrupted Sarah's thoughts. It was a male flight attendant, coming to offer her a drink. His voice was polite, but there was something in his demeanor that reminded Sarah of the gate agent's hesitation, of the quiet assumption that she didn't belong. "No, thank you," Sarah replied, her tone calm but firm. She couldn't help but feel like this moment, this entire situation, was a reflection of something much bigger. She wasn't just being questioned because of an unfortunate mix-up. She was being questioned because of who she was. Her presence, her skin color, didn't fit the mold of what first class was supposed to look like in their eyes. As the flight continued, Sarah's unease only grew. The crew members' interactions with her were curt, almost dismissive, as though she were invisible. The contrast in treatment between Sarah and the other passengers was clear. The white businessmen seated around her were greeted with warm smiles, their every need attended to promptly. But Sarah's requests for simple things like water were ignored, her presence overlooked. Finally, a flight attendant came by and offered drinks again, this time asking if Sarah would like something. When Sarah asked for a bottle of water, the attendant nodded but walked off without stopping to serve her immediately. Sarah felt the familiar sting of exclusion. Her request, so simple, was yet another reminder that she was invisible in this space, where everyone else's comfort seemed to be prioritized above hers. The subtle behavior, the disregard for her presence, built up, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that Sarah couldn't shake. She knew she wasn't imagining it. She had been the subject of racial profiling long enough to recognize the signs. She wasn't just a passenger here. She was the other, the one who didn't quite belong. The plane finally began its descent into Chicago, and Sarah braced herself for the final leg of the journey. Her frustration with the flight attendant's treatment had simmered, but she had remained calm, knowing that any outward show of anger would only fuel the narrative that she didn't belong. She couldn't afford to be the angry black woman, not in this situation, not with her entire credibility on the line. The moment the plane touched down, Sarah felt a sense of relief. She was nearly at the end of her journey, but she could already feel the tension building again. She knew from experience that the real battle would begin once she reached the gate. As she stood to gather her things, Sarah noticed Captain Dana Wright moving through the cabin. Donna's sharp eyes locked onto hers briefly before she continued down the aisle. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of those eyes assessing her, watching her every movement. It was as though Captain Wright couldn't quite make peace with Sarah's presence on her flight. There was no denying it now. Sarah was being treated differently and Dana was complicit in it. When Sarah stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, The familiar hum of the airport greeted her, but something about the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't the usual bustle of travelers. It was charged with something else. As she walked toward the gate area, she saw Linda Cole, the same gate agent from earlier, standing by the podium. Sarah's instinct kicked in. She had a sinking feeling that something was about to go wrong. Sure enough, when Sarah approached the boarding desk to show her first-class ticket for re-entry, Linda looked at it once again, this time with a coldness in her eyes. Her glance flicked up to Sarah, then back to the ticket, and she hesitated. The pause was deliberate, and Sarah could tell it wasn't about confirming her seat. It was about questioning her right to be there. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked, her voice even, though the tension was evident. "I just need to verify this again," Linda said, her tone sharp. Sarah could hear the implication in Linda's voice, as if the ticket wasn't valid, as if she hadn't earned the right to board just like everyone else. As Sarah stood there, waiting for her ticket to be processed, she noticed Captain Wright in the distance, observing the interaction with a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a clear signal. Sarah's right to occupy this space was now in question. "Excuse me," Sarah said, trying to maintain her composure. "I have a valid first-class ticket. I'm a platinum member. There's no issue here." Her calmness didn't mask the frustration that was rising inside her, but she kept her voice level, refusing to let the situation escalate. She had been here before, facing down the same type of scrutiny, but she wasn't about to let this woman, this system, get the better of her. Linda scanned the ticket again, more slowly this time, like she was looking for something to challenge. Sarah felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, the subtle glances of people who had no idea what was happening but sensed the tension. She was being made an example of, and everyone could see it. Finally, Linda stepped aside and called over her supervisor, a man named Thomas Green, who approached with the weariness of someone who had been through this kind of situation too many times before. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice neutral but with an edge of annoyance, as though this was an inconvenience for him. Linda muttered, "I'm not sure. Her boarding pass seems off. I just want to make sure everything's right." Thomas glanced at Sarah's ticket, typing quickly into his system. "The ticket's fine," he said after a moment, turning the screen to show Linda. "First class, 2A, platinum member. She's good to go." Sarah didn't react to the confirmation. The damage had been done. Her right to be there had been questioned for no reason other than her appearance, and nothing would change that now. Linda's expression faltered for just a moment, disappointment flickering across her face, but she quickly masked it. "Sorry for the confusion, ma'am," she said, barely making eye contact. As Sarah walked past the counter, her heart still pounding, she couldn't help but notice the smug expression on Captain Wright's face. The captain hadn't moved from her position, still standing near the gate, watching the scene unfold like a silent conductor orchestrating this moment of subtle harassment. Sarah paused for a moment, her frustration bubbling to the surface. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay composed. The next leg of her journey wasn't over yet. She was almost at her destination, but she knew this was only the beginning of the battle for justice, and she would not let it slip by. As Sarah made her way toward the aircraft door, she could feel the familiar tension in the air. Her body was still tense from the exchange at the gate, but she refused to let the moment define her. She had been through enough in her career to know how to keep her emotions in check. But this felt different. The weight of the scrutiny from Captain Dana Wright and the gate agent, Linda Cole, seemed to follow her every step. The jet bridge was crowded with other passengers, all of them moving toward the door in an orderly fashion. But Sarah felt increasingly isolated. As she approached the aircraft, she noticed Captain Wright walking behind her, maintaining a steady distance. Yet her presence was impossible to ignore. It was as though the captain was making sure Sarah's every move was being watched, her suspicions still hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. When Sarah reached the doorway, she was stopped by another flight attendant, a man named Eric Thompson, who asked to check her bag. It was a standard procedure, but the scrutiny seemed excessive, almost as though her very presence on the plane warranted extra attention. Sarah didn't protest. She had learned long ago that challenging these microaggressions only escalated the situation. She stood still as Eric rifled through her bag, all while Captain Wright stood just a few feet away, observing the scene. The feeling of being targeted, of being treated as less than, crept back into Sarah's mind. It wasn't about her actions or behavior. It was about something else entirely. It was about how others saw her, how they assumed she didn't belong in a space like this. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice steady. But the question was meant for Captain Wright, not Eric. She could feel the captain's gaze on her, cold and calculating. "No problem," Eric replied quickly, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. He repacked her bag hastily, avoiding eye contact. There was no apology for the inconvenience, no acknowledgement that she had done nothing wrong. As Sarah moved forward, the weight of the situation hung in the air. She knew something would happen. It was only a matter of time. When she stepped into the aircraft, she immediately took her seat in the first row of first class, seat 2A. Her shoulders finally relaxed slightly as she settled in. She had earned this seat. She had every right to be here. But the battle wasn't over yet. The flight attendant, Jessica Marsh, walked down the aisle offering pre-flight drinks. She reached the row next to Sarah and immediately began serving the white businessman seated beside her. Sarah watched the interaction, her heart sinking as the attendant moved on without acknowledging her. The man received his drink with a polite smile, while Sarah sat there ignored. "Excuse me," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Could I have a bottle of water, please?" Jessica continued on her way without a word, not even acknowledging Sarah's request. It wasn't the first time Sarah had been treated like this, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But the pattern was clear. It wasn't about the service. It was about making Sarah invisible, about denying her the simple respect she deserved as a paying passenger. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's frustration grew. Each small slight, each ignored request, chipped away at the calm exterior she worked so hard to maintain. She pressed the call button above her seat, hoping to get some attention. But when Jessica passed by again, she simply turned off the call button without saying a word. The other passengers around her seemed oblivious to the injustice unfolding, their attention directed elsewhere. But the businessman in seat 2B, a middle-aged white man who had witnessed the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, raising his voice just enough for Jessica to hear. "The woman next to me has asked for water several times. Could you please bring her some?" Jessica's response was cool and dismissive. "I'll get to her when I have time," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. She continued down the aisle without a second glance at Sarah. The denial of basic service continued with mechanical precision, a stark contrast to the warm treatment extended to others on the plane. Sarah sat there, her dignity intact, but her patience wearing thin. She could see the other passengers in first class receiving attentive service. More drinks, warm towels, magazines, while she was ignored. This was more than just poor service. This was intentional. The message was clear. She didn't belong here. She wasn't worthy of the same respect as the others. Sarah clenched her fists, fighting back the urge to explode. The flight attendant's treatment continued throughout the boarding process, and by the time the plane was nearly full, Sarah felt like a ghost in the cabin. No one acknowledged her presence, not even with a smile or a polite gesture. She had become invisible in this space, and it was a harsh reminder of how she was seen by others, despite her status as a legitimate passenger. Just as Sarah was beginning to feel the full weight of the discrimination she was experiencing, Captain Wright appeared at the front of the cabin for her pre-flight safety check. It was routine for captains to greet passengers before takeoff, but Sarah could tell that this wasn't just a courtesy. Dana Wright's eyes scanned the cabin, and when they landed on Sarah, they narrowed with cold calculation. Sarah's intuition kicked in. This was it. This was where it all would come to a head. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Sarah could feel it the moment Captain Dana Wright stood by the front of the first-class section, making her way towards Sarah's row with deliberate steps. The captain's eyes were cold, and as she walked towards Sarah, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. When Captain Wright reached Sarah's seat, she stopped and looked down at her. Sarah remained calm, her hands resting in her lap, her posture straight and composed. This wasn't the time to break. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment she had been waiting for since the gate. Dana Wright's voice cut through the silence. "There must be some mistake," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. People like you don't belong in first class on my aircraft." The words hung in the air, blatant and cruel, echoing with a history of exclusion and prejudice. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly and her heart pounded, but she remained perfectly still. She wasn't going to let Captain Wright's words trigger an emotional response. She had learned long ago that staying calm in the face of injustice was the only way to regain control of the situation. "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but laced with quiet authority. It was a question that was both simple and impossible to answer, a trap that Dana Wright couldn't escape. Captain Wright's face flushed with anger, and her jaw tightened. She didn't answer right away, but the disdain in her expression was palpable. There was no hiding the prejudices that had shaped her actions up until now. "You know exactly what I mean," Dana Wright snapped, her voice rising. "You don't belong here." Her words were loud and the entire cabin fell silent, the tension mounting with every passing second. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply repeated her question. "What do you mean by people like me?" The room was now aware of the exchange, and passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unsure of how to react. Some looked away, unwilling to intervene, while others watched the confrontation unfold. The businessman from seat 2B, who had witnessed the entire interaction, finally spoke up. "Captain," he said, his voice calm but firm, "she hasn't done anything wrong. I've been watching this whole time, and she's just trying to get through the flight like everyone else. You're the one causing the problem here." Captain Wright's face contorted with disbelief, and her frustration reached its peak. "Stay out of this," she snapped, turning on him with unexpected aggression. But Sarah knew the moment had shifted. The weight of her calm, her composed response, had shifted the dynamic in the room. What was once an isolated attack on her had now turned into something that couldn't be ignored. Passengers had witnessed the unfairness, the bias, and they could see who the real disruptor was. Dana Wright stood still, her anger rising, and before anyone could react, she took a step forward and slapped Sarah across the face. The sound of the slap echoed throughout the cabin, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. For a moment, everything stopped. The passengers were frozen, shocked by the sudden eruption of violence. The flight attendants were too stunned to move, unsure of what to do. But Sarah didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her hand in defense. Instead, she calmly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her badge, her police badge, the one she had carefully left behind when she boarded the flight. The silence in the cabin deepened as Sarah held her badge up for everyone to see. It wasn't just a symbol of her role as a police officer. It was a reminder that her power wasn't just in her uniform, but in her identity, her authority. The moment she revealed the badge, the dynamics in the cabin changed. The shock on Dana Wright's face was unmistakable. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had just assaulted a police chief, and not just any chief, but the chief of the Metropolitan Police. The senior flight attendant, Sarah's longtime nemesis on the flight, immediately went to call for security, but it was already too late. The passengers were already pulling out their phones, recording the moment. The video was soon shared, and by the time the plane landed, it had gone viral. When airport security arrived, the situation was already beyond control. The security officers, who had been briefed on the situation, immediately approached Captain Wright. She tried to protest, tried to claim her position as captain would shield her from the consequences of her actions. But it was all too late. She was arrested right there, in front of a full cabin of witnesses, for assaulting a police officer. Within hours, the story spread beyond the airport. News outlets picked up the footage, and the hashtag number Justice for Sarah trended worldwide. Captain Wright's career ended in an instant, as the investigation revealed a history of discriminatory actions, not just against Sarah, but against other passengers, many of whom came forward with their own stories. Atlantic Airways, facing immense public pressure, quickly took action. Linda Cole and the other flight attendants involved in the incident were fired, and the airline committed to an overhaul of its policies, pledging to implement anti-bias training and to ensure such an incident would never happen again. They also agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement for the affected passengers, including Sarah. The aftermath of the incident was a turning point, not just for Sarah, but for the entire airline industry. The company's actions were seen as a step toward accountability and a moment for passengers to see that real change was possible when power was held accountable. The ripple effect was felt throughout the aviation world as other airlines followed suit, revising their training and implementing policies to prevent discrimination. For Sarah, the fight wasn't over. She continued her work as a police chief, but now she was not just fighting for justice on the streets. She was fighting to change systems that had allowed prejudice to thrive for far too long. And through it all, she held her head high, knowing that sometimes standing up for what's right means making sure the world sees the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be.